ตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ One way you can look at the practice of the Dhamma is that it's a practice or a training in learning how to look after our mind. And they say when we're born alone. We come into the world, we bring our mind with us, we carry our mind with us through our life, and then when we die alone, take our mind with us. So the mind is perhaps the most valuable, useful thing we have as a human being. But we have to learn how to look after it, guide it, protect it. And that's why we do practice meditation, because when you're developing the qualities of the mind through meditation, such as mindfulness, states of peace, calm, and then insight, the mind is going to grow from that, receives the beneficial influence of all that effort and training and practice, and it grows in a good way. And growing in the Buddhist sense might mean becomes brighter, more peaceful, more radiant and clearer, because it's gaining understanding of truth. And as we understand the truth or the Dhamma more, then the cloudiness of confusion, the darkness of confusion and ignorance dissipates. So this is what we mean by the mind growing through the practice. And we learn how to protect the mind, because if you see it as your most valuable asset, the best thing you've got, the most important thing you've got in your life, then you'll want to protect it. And we spend most of our time trying to protect and nourish and look after the body and the material side of our life, the comforts and so on. But really we should put a lot of effort into looking after this mind as well. And in the Buddhist teachings, there's two qualities that they call the protectors of the mind, the protectors of the world. The lokabala, the hiri and ottappa. The hiri is a sense of shame. Ottappa is fear of the consequences of wrong actions through body, speech and mind. These are like the guardian angels, guardian devas that look after us, but they're qualities that arise internally, and they're associated with wisdom and understanding. So once you have some understanding about the value of your mind as something that you want to look after, protect, treat well, educate, and so on, then these two qualities make more sense, because they're what will help you to look after it and protect it from harm, from danger. So sometimes they use similes for these two qualities. They call them the guardian deities of the world, the protectors of our mind, of our heart. And they compare them like, say you were to pick a stick up, and on one end of that stick was some human excrement, fresh, smelling bad. On the other end of the stick, something very hot, a red hot piece of iron or something like that, you wouldn't want to touch either end of the stick, because human excrement is something dirty, ugly, smelly. You don't want it anywhere near you. You wash it away as soon as you can. You avoid it. And a red hot piece of metal would burn you, hurt you. So either end of the stick, there's nothing there that you want. And these two qualities are like that. They're the mind that sees the harm in unwholesome or unskillful courses of action, whether thoughts, unskillful speech, unskillful actions, physical actions. As we're developing an understanding of how to look after this mind, and particularly understanding the law of karma, then the mind wants to shrink away from unskillful thinking, because you know it will lead to more stress, more unhappiness for you. Shrink away from unskillful speech, shrink away from unskillful action. And it won't want to do things that will have consequences that will bring you pain and suffering, or pain and suffering to others. These two qualities are the guardians, those qualities that protect the mind from falling into those ways of behavior through body, speech and mind. They say hiri, the sense of shame, it's more of an internal quality. When you do value your mind, your humanity, who you are, then with that awareness and that understanding, you have this sense of shame. You don't want to do things that will bring you harm. And that can even just be a thought. You don't want to think a thought that will make you miserable, unhappy, deluded. You don't want to say and do things. And so the mind is developing this awareness by developing a sense of shame, that one doesn't want to do things that will reduce one's humanity, take away one's goodness. And it becomes something that we call a positive emotion, something that brings up a very important feeling, and it's often experienced just as a feeling. A sense of shame is maybe not even having to think about a thought or an action, a course of action that you're wanting to take, or a thought that comes up. It's not always something you have to sit down and think about and reason with in your mind. Often it's just a feeling of saying, I don't want to think like this, that thought is no good, that thought is something to be discarded, got rid of, just like excrement. And I don't want to speak or act on it. And it can bring up a very powerful feeling of turning away from a negative thought or a negative course of action, just the thought of it. It's not always clear though. The sense of shame is not always well developed, it's not always present, so sometimes we only learn about it after the event. So when you think back, as we all can do, sometimes think back to various unwholesome thoughts that we've indulged in, held on to, followed in our thinking and our way we're looking at our life at that particular time in that situation. Obviously, it could be thoughts of anger or selfishness, greed, jealousy. The more kind of ugly, harmful kind of thoughts. When we think back to times when we've been under the influence of those, what we call the mental defilements, the mind can shrink away again and think, oh, how could I think that? How could I speak in that way? How could I act in that way? So sometimes the sense of shame comes up after the event, but still it's a valid reflection, and it might lead us to think, oh, I don't want to do that again. It's just so unpleasant. It's just the wrong way to go about things. But ideally, as the more we train in mindfulness and train in the Buddhist path, the more our understanding develops, then these positive emotions like a sense of shame come up quite naturally, And so one steers away from what sometimes even one's own more negative thinking. So it's an internal quality based just on an awareness that when the mind is free from regret, free from feelings of guilt, remorse, it's happy. And you don't want to lose that happiness, you don't want to damage it by indulging in negative courses of action, even just negative thoughts. The other quality that is a guardian, protector of the world, a protector of us, is ottappa, which means like fear of the consequences of unskillful action. So this is more, the mind is thinking in an external way, like thinking about what other people think of us, our effect on the world. So they use the simile of the piece of hot metal on the end of a rod. You wouldn't want to touch it because you know you'll get hurt. You wouldn't want to give it to someone else. You know it would hurt them. It's that kind of reflection. It's awareness that what we say and do and think matters, has consequences for us. And if we want to preserve our happiness and develop our mind, our heart in a good way, then we have a responsibility for what we think, say and do, and we want to train the mind. We want to learn how to, again, steer away from courses of action that will lead to other people criticizing us, other people wanting to harm us even because of what we said and done, or even just what we've thought. So these are like, these two qualities they're like the guardian devas, the guardian angels of the world. And one way we develop them is sometimes by looking out at other people and the world around us and see what are the consequences when people lose these two qualities. Well, then they start to act in ways that can be very destructive to themselves and others. And often with unawareness, not realizing what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're thinking. It can cause all kinds of suffering. So maybe the worst kind of scenario you can think of in life may be being caught into a war, a situation where there's a war in the world. And unfortunately there usually is some kind of war or armed conflict going on in the world at any one time. You imagine if you were in that place, there's people walking around, moving around with weapons, trying to control, harm or kill others. It's a very unpleasant situation to be in. And what tends to happen in those situations is you see the worst side of people, and you can still see very good things in a war zone, people trying to help each other and do the right thing, but it's a time when you'll see the worst of people, where they'll act in ways to harm each other without any regard for the value of human life, property, say. That's a time where these two guardian deities, these two guardian angels that look after human beings tend to fade out from people's experience. And the worse it gets, well, the less they are there in their experience. But normally speaking, we're not in a war situation. Normally you're living your life in wherever you are, whichever country, whichever city, place. Those two qualities are what preserve the peace in the community that you live in. So, say you live in a city, the reason you can normally walk down the street, go about your business and feel reasonably safe, we're not deluded, we know there's always some chance of bad things happening, say, but generally you can go about your business in peace, feeling safe. It's because those two qualities are at least somewhat present in the minds of ordinary people. You walk down the street, people are not attacking you, they're not abusing you, normally speaking. You can just go about your business, people are not threatening you, trying to steal your things. Of course, those experiences are taking place in the world, but generally it's a minority of people's experience. Normally, people can go about their business and nothing untoward happens. And that's because in the general population, these two qualities of shame, fear of the consequences of wrongdoing are present. It's that sense of, oh, I couldn't do that. You couldn't exploit someone else. You couldn't physically hurt them. You wouldn't want to verbally abuse them. You wouldn't want to steal their property, and so on. So there are qualities that come about through understanding the importance of ourselves, our own humanity, and the value of that, and the wish for peace and happiness in ourselves, but then also understanding the importance of our relationship to the world. And this is something that comes through the practice of waking up to truth, waking up to reality. We see these two qualities are vital to develop and preserve in ourselves. And when we preserve them in ourselves, well, that tends to have a good effect on people around us. So it's one of the roles of Buddhist monastics in the world and Buddhist monasteries in the world, is to try and encourage through example and through teaching these two very qualities, encourage them in the hearts and minds of people. So when you come to a Buddhist monastery, most people understand quite automatically, oh, it's a place where you do good, you try not to do evil, you try to restrain yourself from even thinking evil thoughts, let alone speaking or acting in evil, harmful ways. Most people have that understanding, and that's why they come back to a Buddhist monastery over and over again, because they have that sense of good feeling that arises. And partly it's because of the presence of these two qualities, shame, fear of the consequences of harmful behavior, wrongdoing. That's apparent. Maybe one isn't immediately aware of the root cause of that good feeling, but the good feeling is apparent in one's mind. One feels good, one feels safe in a Buddhist monastery. So that's one gift that a Buddhist monastery provides the world. It's a place where you get a good example, a good feeling, and you learn something. You learn to be more aware of what you're thinking, what you're saying, what you're doing. Because Buddhist monastics, monks and nuns, develop this sense of shame, fear of wrongdoing in a very direct way every day in their practice, because they have a very high standard of discipline. They're developing mindfulness, developing the path that the Buddha taught, and they develop right understanding, and they know it's the best way to live is by cultivating these two qualities. Of course, everybody, while we're still human, we're still not fully enlightened, and we sometimes have lapses. And so each of us has a duty, has a role, a responsibility to learn from our experience and try and improve on ourselves. So say in a Buddhist monastery, one thing you'll see takes place every 2 weeks. The monks, they come together to hear the recitation of the Buddhist monastic code. They're reminded of their rules over and over again. They discuss them, they consider the rules of training, and they develop mindfulness around this. And so when they sometimes forget themselves, get caught into a negative way of speaking or acting, then either maybe a good friend will perhaps remind them with out of well-wishing that they're losing it, they're going in the wrong direction, or more likely just themselves. Each individual constantly is reviewing their discipline and their level of practice. And so you get better at it, and it becomes more normal to have these two qualities in your behavior. So say in Buddhist monasteries, they're not usually a place where you'll get an outbreak of war or armed conflict. You may get some disagreements, conflict, just arguments occasionally, but very quickly the community as a whole will try and re-establish the right attitude, the right understanding, the right practice, because of the presence of these two qualities in the hearts and minds of people, because they have right understanding, what is good, what is bad, what is right and wrong, and so on. So a Buddhist monastery tends to be a place where you come and you feel peaceful, safe. So something we notice here, not during lockdown, but normally speaking, we get lots of visitors. So sometimes visitors come to the monastery and they're forgetful, so they may leave their purse or their wallet or some item of value. They just put it down and they forget for a while. Maybe they're off guard, maybe they're more relaxed than normal, but that can make us forgetful. So they leave their valued item somewhere in the meditation hall or in the kitchen, and then they go away. What will happen in a monastery is someone will see it, maybe pick it up and put it in a safe place, maybe try to find who the owner is, or if the owner's gone away, we'll just keep it for them. And that happens regularly. In our monastery, we've had people leave, wallets and purses full of cash, full of credit cards or something, and not very often, but it does happen. And never once does anybody in the monastery think, oh, we should steal that. What you do is you pick it up and you put it somewhere safe. That's because of the presence of hiri, ottappa, or the sense of shame, fear of the consequence of one's evil or wrong actions. It's just quite normally present in people practicing in a monastery. And that's good for the world to have places like this to remind us that people can live together harmoniously with respect for life, property. It's a great gift for the world. So when one comes in contact with the teachings, one may not always be able to visit a monastery, but when one hears the teachings, practices the teachings, reflects on them, one is inclining to those same kind of qualities, and then you can bring them up in your daily life. And it's like you always have a guardian angel with you. But the guardian angel is not some external being. We can't see them. We don't know if they exist or not, maybe. But in our hearts, we can see whether those qualities are present. And you can see when you do have an awareness of what is good and bad karma, and you try to abandon the roots of bad karma, so intentions rooted in greed, anger, delusion, and you try to develop wholesome intentions rooted in non-greed, non-anger, non-delusion, it develops a very good feeling. It contributes to our own inner happiness and well-being, and then to the good feeling and the good environment around us. It's worth doing. They're qualities that are worth cultivating in our lives and in our practice, because they look after us. They keep us out of trouble, and they're keeping other people out of trouble. So it's something that these qualities, they're not often talked about in life, in society. They're not that, you might say, it's not a kind of fashionable conversation topic when you meet people to talk about the qualities of shame, fear of wrongdoing, but they're actually vital for the development of the human mind, and they're worth taking some time to consider and then to see how we can develop them. Sometimes it's when we lose those qualities, it's only then that we realize how valuable, how important they are. When we give in to extreme anger and can say or do something and be very destructive, or even just sometimes when we give in to a train of thought, we have a very powerful negative train of thought, and we have the thought, I could throttle that guy because they've said something or done something we don't approve of, don't like, and we have a reaction where we feel really strongly against that person, or we have a very strong desire, maybe sexual desire or just greed for something that would lead us to do something totally inappropriate in a situation. Maybe those thoughts come up. If the hiri ottappa is there, well, it keeps them in check, at least they don't spill out into our behavior. But if we lose our hiri ottappa, our sense of shame, fear of consequences of wrongdoing, and we do actually act in that way or speak in that way, then it just leads too quickly to disaster and a lot of regret, unhappiness, and maybe not only for us, but other people. So that's a reflection we take on every day as part of our training to see, you might say, what level or where are these two guardian angels? Are they present today in my thinking, my awareness, or have they disappeared? Have they gone on holiday? When we get caught into more unwholesome ways of behavior and thinking. In the time of the Buddha, there was a monk who was actually very well supported. He was an older monk. His wife died. He came into the Sangha, and because he was quite wealthy as a layman, when he came into the Sangha, he had a lot of support, and he brought a lot of requisites, clothing and luxury items with him because he was so well supported. And he actually ended up filling the whole storeroom in the monastery full of stuff, his own personal possessions. And so some of the monks started to question this. Why has this monk got so much stuff? He's got a whole storeroom full of cloth and honey and other kinds of useful things that monks are allowed, but he seemed to have it in such vast quantities, it seemed to be a bit inappropriate. So the monks asked the Buddha, they said, why has this monk got so much stuff? And the Buddha told the story of one of his past lives, what we call the Jataka tales, about this particular monk who had so much stuff. He said in that life, previous life, when the Buddha was still a bodhisattva, somebody who was made an aspiration to become a Buddha, but is fulfilling that life after life, developing their barami. In that life, the bodhisattva was born as a prince. And Prince had a younger brother, but then the king's wife, who was their mother, died, so the king took on a second wife, and the second wife bore a child. It was a male child, so the king was so happy. He now had 3 sons. He's very happy, and he's so happy with his second wife, who bore him another son. He declared to her, he said, "Oh, whatever you want, you can have. I'm so happy. I'm the happiest man in the world. You've given me a son. I thought when my first wife died, that was it. I'm not going to get any more children, but you've given me another child. I'm so happy." So his second wife, the new queen, was very smart. She said, okay. So she heard his gift, that you can have anything you want, but she didn't ask for anything at that time. But later on, when these 3 children, the oldest of which was the bodhisattva, were growing up, became young men, the woman, the mother of the youngest son, who was the second queen, she came to the king and said, now is the time. I want to claim what you have to give me, because you said I can have anything I want when my son was born. Now he's come of age. I want to reclaim that, what you owe me. And the king said, oh dear, he hadn't thought that she'd be so smart. He thought she'd forgotten all about that. But no, she had remembered. And he said, well, what do you want? She said, I want the kingdom for my son, the third of these 3 sons the king had had. And the king said, oh dear, what am I going to do? But before he'd decided what he could do to get out of this, because he knew there might be trouble if the third son gets all the kingdom and the other 2 don't get anything, the first 2 sons, the older sons, the oldest of which was the bodhisattva, had a thought, and they thought, there's a lot of trouble running a kingdom. We don't really want a whole kingdom. Look how much trouble it causes. It causes suffering between people, jealousy, rivalry. Maybe we'll just quietly leave the palace and leave them to it. They can sort out who gets the kingdom. So they were quite spiritually inclined. They didn't want a lot of wealth, power in the normal way of people. So they decided to sneak away from the palace and go and stay in the forest. They were adults now, or young adults now. They thought they can look after themselves. But when the third son heard this, and normally they got on well together, when he saw what they were doing, he joined them. He didn't want to take on the kingdom either. He didn't want it. So the 3 sons, the 3 princes, went off into the forest, and they came to a lake, beautiful lake in the forest, where a yakkha was living. The yakkha was a giant, and this giant had been living there for a long time. He'd been living there for a long time, and what he normally ate was people. He's a giant that ate people, that's how he survived. And he'd been given a special blessing when he became a giant by the king of all giants. And the king of all giants said, you're allowed to take anyone who comes into this lake for a bath or a wash or to drink the water, if they can't answer one question. I'll give you a question you can answer. Everybody who comes here, and if they can't answer the question, you can eat them. And this allowance was that if he asked the question, what is the Deva Dhamma? What is the Dhamma of Devas, of angels? And they can't answer it correctly, then the giant can eat them. So the giant was living there from time to time, eating people, and these 3 young princes turned up. And they were having a rest in the forest, and they thought, there's a lake nearby, better send the young one down to get some water for the rest of us to have a wash and have a drink. So they sent him down, but the giant was there, and he caught the young boy because he'd gone into the water, and he said, I've got you now. But he had to do his duty and ask the question, what is the Dhamma of Devas? And the young boy answered, the sun and the moon. It didn't work. That's not the right answer. So the yakkha said, I'm going to keep you. Meanwhile, the bodhisattva noticed the younger prince hadn't returned, so he sent the second prince down to check what happened to the first. He got down to the pond and again went into the pond to collect water and look for his brother. Couldn't find him, but he's now in the pond, so the giant came up and said, you've got to answer one question for me, otherwise I've got you. And the prince was asked, what is the Deva Dhamma? What is the Dhamma of Devas? And he thought, is it the Dhamma of the 4 directions? Perhaps he was thinking of the 4 Brahmaviharas, we don't know, but he answered the 4 directions, and the giant said, no, wrong answer, now I've got you. So he's got 2 of the brothers, they both answered wrongly, and he kept them, planning to eat them. Meanwhile, the bodhisattva thought, oh dear, my 2 brothers haven't returned, something's up. And he's a bit smarter than them, so he went down to the lake, saw the footprints going into the lake but not returning, so he realized something was up, suspected maybe there was some evil force or evil guy around. So he's just standing there contemplating what to do, but the giant came up anyway and said, why don't you go into the water and have a nice bath? And the bodhisattva said, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't trust you, I don't trust this place. And the giant realized, this guy is different. He's a bit more cautious, more careful than the others. But the bodhisattva had a problem. He has to try and save his two brothers. So the giant said, well, you haven't come into the water. Normally, if you come into the water, I've got you if you can't answer a question. And the bodhisattva says, well, ask the question anyway, let's see, because I've got to save my 2 brothers, which you're keeping. And so the giant was kind of impressed with the bodhisattva and his calm, quiet demeanor. So he asked the bodhisattva his question, what are the Deva Dhammas? And the bodhisattva, being a bodhisattva, knew instantly what they were. He said, hiri, ottappa, shame and fear of wrongdoing. And then he explained them, gave her like a little Dhamma talk. And the giant was so impressed, he gave back the 2 brothers. He actually asked the Buddha, which brother do you want first? Or which brother do you want back? And the Buddha said, I'll take the youngest one. And the giant was a bit skeptical at that point. He said, you've asked for your younger brother. He's not your blood brother, and he's going to inherit the kingdom. Surely you'd want your second brother, who's your real close blood brother. And the Buddha said, the bodhisattva said, yeah, maybe, but if I was to return just with my second brother and not the younger half-brother, everyone might think we killed him to get the kingdom. So I want you to return the younger brother who's destined to inherit the kingdom. And the giant said, okay. But the giant was so impressed that the bodhisattva asked for the youngest brother. He gave him the second brother anyway. So they all returned happily ever after. They lived happily ever after, and eventually the bodhisattva became the king. They kind of negated after the queen died, the one who the king had made the wish to. They returned to the sort of normal way that the eldest brother receives the kingdom, And he was very grateful and compassionate for the giant. He said, "Oh, you can carry on living in this place, but we'll make you a nice house. Now you've got to be a good giant, and you've got to practice the Dhamma and stop eating people and just dedicate yourself to practicing the Dhamma," which the yakkha, the giant, agreed to. Anyway, the outcome of this story was when the Buddha was telling it to the monks, he said, well, that yakkha eventually, having established right view and stopped killing people, he became this monk. And because he'd done so much good for so many lifetimes, done a lot of dana, practicing dana, it all came back to him in his last life, and he was very well supported. Meanwhile, the three brothers, well, the eldest was the Buddha, the second was Venerable Sariputta, and the third was Venerable Ananda, the Buddha's attendant monk. That's a very famous story in Buddhist cultures, just pointing out the importance of knowing the Deva Dhammas. And the Buddha said really what the Deva Dhammas, hiri, ottappa, this sense of shame, fear of wrongdoing, are what protect us from the mental defilements of greed, anger and delusion. And the giant, the yakkha, symbolizes greed, anger and delusion. And you see, when people lose their sense of shame, they're no longer considering the consequences of their actions. Well, then anger can take over, greed takes over, delusion and confusion takes over, and all kinds of destruction and suffering arises, whether you're just looking at your own life. If you lose your sense of shame, your sense of what's appropriate, what's not, you can do anything, you can say anything, you can act in very evil ways. And you look in history, or even in the world today, when people act in a very immoral, unkind, cruel way, often they've just lost those qualities. We say they've lost the plot, they've lost their awareness of what's right and wrong, good and bad. And their mind is getting dragged down by it, and they can act in very unskillful ways and cause themselves a lot of suffering and other people a lot of suffering. Whereas if we preserve these qualities, it's like we constantly have guardian angels with us. We look after ourselves, we look after the world around us, other people. You get the very opposite. You get very constructive things taking place. Good things happen. People treat each other well. And their minds develop. Their minds mature towards letting go of the causes of suffering and experiencing the peace and happiness that we all want. So maybe for today, I'll just give you this much teaching and encourage you to develop a lot of shame and understand the law of karma so that you can avoid falling into making bad karma through body, speech and mind. And you'll find that this is a cause for your practice to progress. You'll find more peace, more happiness for it. So I wish you all well, and if there's time, maybe we can have a little discussion after this.